Hi everybody. Today is just me on the podcast, and I'm going to be talking to you about British literature and composition. We have at Arise year one and year two British literature and composition classes. But I want to talk more in general to begin with about why we study old books. Our classes we build them out through periods. So our year one has Tudor and then Georgian, and then year two has Victorian and 20th century. So we begin by studying Shakespeare and Tudor poetry, and then we go on to study Jane Austen and Romantic poetry, and then we do Dickens and Victorian poetry, and then we finish off by looking at the works of C.S. Lewis and early 20th century poem. Actually, we look at the war poems of the that were written by the poets right about the First World War, because there's so much rich poetry that was created from all that trauma at that time. We are intentionally choosing books that are older, that are rich, that have a real depth and a real value. We look at the works of Shakespeare. So much of Shakespeare is such a pillar of the English language, and it does our teen service to be able to be familiar with his works and to have studied at least one of his plays in a really deep way. So we look at Merchant of Venice. This is a great play that explores wonderful ideas of justice, of mercy, of anti-Semitism, and it allows us to ask some really important questions. We're able to really look at this play, and lift it up as a mirror to ourselves. Shakespeare has a commentary about the anti-Semitism that is being perpetrated by the Christians against Shylock the Jew. And we have this idea of flawed heroes, and also a antagonist who garnishes our sympathy. And he plays with these ideas. He breaks the mold in his own time, where at that time, if you were writing about a Jew, the Jew would be the villain, the Jew would be the baddie, the stereotype, this caricature of a Jew, which we would recognise today as being really anti-Semitic. And Shakespeare really challenges that idea by humanising his antagonist. And the heroes of our play, Antonio, who's the Merchant of Venice, he's a bit of an insipid character. He shows very little agency, and he's not particularly likable. His comrades, his friends, those around him who he likes, like him. He's generous to them. But when you look at him beyond the fact that he gives lots of money to his friends, you think this guy doesn't really have much going for him. And so we have this, it brings us to ask some really uncomfortable questions, which are important about ourselves as people, about who are we prejudiced against? How do we treat people? Even Portia, who's the heroine of the story, one of her great speeches is about the what mercy is like, and she's calls an attribute that is divine. It points to God. That God truly is mercy, and without God's mercy, we would never receive mercy. And she explores this whole idea of the mercy of God, and how if we want to be like Christ, we need to be showing mercy. She doesn't show mercy. We see her acting a way which is actually a bit cruel and a bit manipulative, and we see this hypocrisy being played out within the play, and it creates a really interesting space for teens to ask hard questions about the nature of the world and nature of the church, and how we should be outliving our lives, and what is the right way to live our lives. We then look at some of the poetry. We don't actually look at the sonnets of Shakespeare. We look at Edmund Spenser, who was a famous Elizabethan poet and also a female poet who's perhaps not very well known, called Lady Mary Roth, who was the first woman to have a sonnet sequence actually published, and the first woman to have a work of prose published, which I think gives us a lovely bridge to Jane Austen, who is again this big literary figure, a giant of her in English literature. Not so appreciated in her time. She did have a measure of fame, but obviously being a woman in the 18th, early 19th century, she struggled to really get that success that her work would have really merited. We study Pride and Prejudice, which is a really great gateway book into the work of Jane Austen. And we're able to discuss, and many people think Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice is a girl book, it's just a love story, but it's so much more than just a romance. We have a fantastic social commentary. She's highly satirical and witty. She's looking at the world in which she lives on with this critical eye, looking at this idea of the role of women and how they really, to be secure, they need to be looking to marry somebody with money. The whole opening line of Pride and Prejudice is, "It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single young man in possession of a great fortune must be in want of a wife." And obviously that's ridiculous. But that's the premise on which all this is built on, that the young women, they need to marry somebody with money or they're going to end up pretty destitute as they get older because they can't earn money for themselves. It's not respectable. So there's this tension at the heart of Georgian society, which Jane Austen really unpacks through all her novels. We also have this idea, it's not so much in Pride and Prejudice, she explores it more in Sense and Sensibility, but this idea of the rational mind and the romantic mind. So we would look at the romantic poetry, but Jane Austen was quite critical of the romantic movement as a whole. She was really in that older way of thinking from the 19th century, the 18th century, sorry, of rationalism, of using your intellect to think things through and not just run into something head over heels and give vent to all your emotion. And I think this is a really interesting idea for us to explore. We think of Jane Austen, we think of her work as being romantic, and there is romance in them, but it's tempered with sound judgment. And I think especially for teenagers, this is a really good message to have, that we're emotional beings, of course, and God has made us to love, and He wants us to be loved, and He wants our young people to have healthy relationships with members of the opposite sex, but we're also rational, that this idea of our emotions and our mind being completely disconnected can sometimes be unhealthy, and Jane Austen really brings them together, that we're thinking rational beings, and that is a gift from God. And we we see in her heroes, these are moral characters. One of the things that when Elizabeth is thinking through, she starts to think rationally about the behaviour of Wickham and the behaviour of Mr. Darcy, and weighing up everything she knows about them, and she realises she's made an error of judgment, even though she prides herself on her ability to judge characters highly. And one of the things that she says about Darcy is that she'd never noticed anything I can't even say that word, irreligious in his character, that she acknowledges that actually he's a bit proud, and he's not very sociable, but actually he's not ever done anything really, really bad. And as she begins to see him, she actually realizes that he doesn't go around saying how amazing he is, but quietly he's actually a really good man with a good, strong moral compass. Um, and we look at all these ideas when we're looking at Austen, and we pick them up as we again look into the romantic poets at that time. And explore the works of Wordsworth, we do some Coleridge, and we finish off with a little bit of John Keats. Year 2, we do Charles Dickens, and we look at the work of Great Expectations, and we study the work, we look at the time period, we look at the ideas of social injustice that are rife at that time, big things, big ideas that Dickens really played with, and this idea of what does success mean. This boy Pip, he's an orphan, he's poor, he's not destitute, but his life's hard, and he's given this great expectation of lots of money, and it's this idea that if only I had money, my life would be better. I think it's something that a lot of people throughout, regardless of when they live, they think if we could just get a lot of money, everything would be better. Our life would be better. And Dickens plays with this idea of, and he plays with it in other books as well, but that things don't go better for Pip. Things actually go worse for Pip. He's just in nicer clothes, but they don't do well with them. Morally, he kind of goes off the rails, and he, not badly, but just in a silly young manish kind of way, just not irredeemably, but he doesn't make good choices. And it's this idea of a coming of age story where he has this realization things start to fall apart from him, and he has some choices to make. And through the suffering that he goes through, starts to make good choices, and he redeems himself. He starts to act as a man of honor and a man of dignity, and going the way which is going to cost him, instead of just trying to look good and look fashionable and be a gentleman. He makes the right choices, even if they might not, even if it means aligning himself to those who are not valued in Victorian society. And so we see this shift in his character, and that the things that actually make a man great are not having lots of money. They're about honour, they're about dignity, they're about hard work. And you see Pip's kind of stepfather figure, his adoptive father figure, is this steady man throughout the whole of the novel, he's not very intelligent, but he's so morally good, and he's so loyal, and he's so loving and protective, and he's he takes on this image almost of a kind of a Christ-like figure of just being there and being forgiving and stepping in and showing great mercy, and Pip's able to redeem himself at the end of the book. So we explore all these ideas, and at the end of it we come round and we're asking ourselves, well, is this these big kind of ideas that are very Christian and very that they're embedded within the New Testament. And then we look at Dickens' own life and we ask ourselves, would we call him a Christian novelist? Would we call Great Expectations a Christian book? And we wrestle with these ideas, um, looking at the church of his time, looking at Dickens' own personal beliefs and his own faith, and look into what does that actually mean. And we also look at the Victorian poetry. We look at Lord Tennyson with Charge of the Light Brigade. We look at Gerard Manley Hopkins, and we also there's a choice for the end of it. We have a presentation where the class pick a poet from the Victorian era, and they have to do a presentation on that poet and talk about the poet, the ideas, and the different literary devices that are used within that poem to convey those ideas and those themes. And then year 2, we look at the work of C.S. Lewis. So it's quite a different type of book, no longer a novel. We look at Mere Christianity, and we discuss this idea of this. What's Dickens talking about? This idea of it was originally a radio production that was aired during the Second World War, and it was an exploration of faith, and it's a great work of apologetics. And Lewis starts off at this beginning premise of all people, regardless of their where they're born, their heritage, their nationality, regardless of what time in history they've been born in, every single person is born with some kind of moral compass, and he takes that as his starting premise, that everyone has an idea of something, that there's good behaviour and bad behaviour, and then he unpacks that as basically the thing that ultimately will point us to there being a God, and then what God, and it leads narrowing it down until we get to the God of the Bible. And he takes it from this very broad big idea of all humanity, narrowing it down until he has he's really exploring the ideas of the fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith. We then look at screw tape letters, which are more satirical, and it's this idea of, he had this idea of wanting to explore the nature of temptation and sin, but he does it through these witty letters of a senior demon writing training letters to a junior demon. And all the action is done through this correspondence from Screw Tape, the uncle, the older demon. And the person that they're writing about, we just know him as the patient. We never know his name, and we can, through the letters, we can trace this man's faith journey from salvation to his death. And they marry really well together, looking at Mere Christianity and Screw Tape. A lot of what Dickens talks about in Mere Christianity is very big, difficult ideas of theology and doctrine. He really unpacks them through Screw Tape. So reading the two in parallel opens up your understanding of both texts in a very rich way. And we finish off, as I mentioned previously, with war poetry of that were by many of these poets that went through the First World War, and their reaction to it was this great outpouring of literary genius, and some really profound work was produced at the end of the First World War that asks many questions about the horror, the trauma, the nature of war, and asks us some really big ideas about life and about how, as believers, we respond to such traumatic experiences. So that's the kind of overarching view of the literature classes. One of the questions that we ask, that I've been asked, is, does this course align with iGCSE English? It does not align with iGCSE English literature, because the texts for iGCSE English literature change every year, and they're not so broad on a time period. So this is not an iGCSE English literature class. However, I built this class to align with the syllabus for iGCSE English language for the Cambridge spec. I took the syllabus, and I looked at all the different things that are being tested on in the exam, and I used big texts, great texts, in order to teach the ideas and the skills that are required for the English language exam. So things like, in the exam, you have two papers. You have a reading paper and you have a writing paper. So in the reading paper, a lot of it's to do with comprehension. So being able to read a text and understand explicit, implicit meanings, and the different attitudes and the tone, the mood of a text. So we're choosing these works that are written by some of the finest writers of the English language, and we're able to then, as we analyse them and read them and study what they're saying, we're looking at these ideas of implicit and explicit meaning. We're looking at the tone and the mood, and being able, how have these writers created these ideas without explicitly saying this is what's going on. For example, at the beginning of Great Expectations, Pip, the protagonist, is just a little boy, and he has this really quite scary event happening in his life, and Dickens layers this up by creating the setting, by creating the mood, by the use of the conversation that's have, but it's a lot of it's done subtly. And so by reading these texts, you're exposing yourself. It's very difficult to teach um, the an implicit meaning. It's a lot of that comes with maturity. So with English language exams, it's always better to wait a little bit longer. The exam's based for a 16-year-old to sit, and you need that cognitive development to happen, because that idea of being able to read a text and understand what's happening kind of under the surface is something that only comes with age. But being exposed to great works of literature helps develop that by reading, even just all the reading aloud that you do with your children, reading good quality works. You're exposing them to these ideas, the implicit meaning, the explicit meaning, rich language. All of that is setting that foundation needed for an English language exam. And we do not do these things just so they can sit their exam when they're 16. We do them because we want them to be educated and to think well. But the bonus of reading great works to our children all through their childhood is that when they come to sit an exam at 16, they're going to be in a really good position. Again, when we're reading these texts, we're looking at analysing, evaluating, and developing the facts, ideas, opinion that we need to discuss these works, to have an idea about that. Having an idea, for example, in our Great Expectations, saying, I think Dickens was writing this as a social commentary that is based on his faith, and this is why. And so you've got an idea and you're supporting it with evidence from the text, from his life. You're able to look at I think Pride and Prejudice is not a romance because, and why is it not just a romance novel? What else what else is going on here that would support that idea that it's not just a love story, a kind of a chick flick type of novel. You're taking the text, you're looking at the ideas, you're looking at the way it's written, and be able to form your own opinion, or they're able to form their opinion and then back it up with evidence. What's been brilliant seeing the essays that previous students have written about the same texts, and you have two students who write and argue a different idea, completely polar opposite idea from the same text, using different evidence from the text, and their essays are both brilliant. And that's this idea that we're able to do that. These are not just one-dimensional books that we've chosen here. These are rich works where you can be thinking about them in different ways from different angles. We want to, from all that, we need to know how are they doing this. So we need to look, how does a writer achieve the effects to influence readers? How are they doing it? What are the word choices they're using? What are the literary devices? Why does alliteration? Why would somebody use alliteration? What purpose does it have? We can say, oh, there's alliteration. That's not just so you can use something that's kind of clever. What is the purpose behind it? And there is a purpose behind it. There's a purpose for using assonance or consonants, and why, what effect does that have, and how does it work? How does the structure of this paragraph, how does this affect how we're reading it? What is the imagery that's being created? How are they using sensory language to create a really to make this feel visceral? When Dickens writes about Miss Havisham's home, it's trapped in time, and you're reading about seeing her table with this decaying wedding cake, and everything's rotting and decaying, and you can almost feel viscerally that the sense of horror that it creates in Pip, but at the same time a sense of deep compassion for this broken woman who is living with this severe mental illness, and you're looking at her and you see the brokenness of her life, the dilapidation of her home, and you're just but it's done, the way he writes it is so visceral, and you can almost smell the mold of her surroundings. It's done so powerfully. How has he done that? It's not everybody that can write something and make it something that you can almost feel. And so we're looking at those literary devices. We're looking at those effects to think how is this done, and how can we identify them in a text. So we're looking at those skills that we can then transfer to any text, um, and be able to pick out those devices, pick out let's find interesting words and think, well, why did they pick that word and not a different word? And and it's all part of the writer's craft. um, that ties in with being able to select and use information. So being able to, for example, when we do Merchant of Venice, we will use the text and then we'll write a report as if we were a journalist reporting on the court case within the play. And so they're selecting information from the play and repurposing it as if they were writing a journalistic report for a newspaper. And so we have similar writing activities for the different texts, where they're selecting information, they're having to repurpose it, write it in a different form, in a different style, um, for a specific purpose. So that's the reading element. We've also got the writing element. So with all, we want to be able to articulate and write clearly. So we have a combination of there's imaginative writing, where we have different activities for writing stories. I think these are always really popular. I've had some really amazing short stories written that are using text as a inspiration. For example, with Jane Austen, we write a short story there's a few writing prompts that they can choose from. Some are kind of almost like a prequel to Pride and Prejudice. Some are a sequel to Pride and Prejudice, where you're looking at some of the lesser characters and creating a backstory that either continues from Pride and Prejudice left off or was beforehand. And so we've had some really fun little stories written from that. Again, it's pulling on the text, the knowledge that we have about these characters from what's in Pride and Prejudice, and then we're using our own imagination to build out from there. We look at how to structure more formal essays, like discursive essays, persuasive essays, comparison essays, and how would you write these out clearly with your introduction? How do we select information to answer an essay question? How do we arrange it? How do we pick evidence from the text or from the historical or contextual background or the historical background for those texts to back up what we think and what we want to argue? And we learn that format for how to write well. We look at how to structure different types of sentences, using short sentences, longer sentences, more complex sentence structure, and how to use the vocabulary that is richer and more precise in its meaning. So it's not always about creating really long sentences. It's about picking really good words, which might not be the I think it was Churchill who talks about not using a long word when or maybe sorry, Churchill and Lewis who said don't choose a big word when a short word is going to be better. So it's about picking the right words for the purpose for which you want them to be in your book. So we talk about the idea of nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs, and how sometimes if you pick a good noun, you don't need the extra adjective, because that noun um, creates an image all of its own. Instead of having a man where you have to add adjectives around that to describe that man, you can specific what type of man. You can choose a noun that will describe the type of man that you are talking about. So, like clergyman, for example, if you think about Pride and Prejudice, you're able to use very exact word choice. And the same happens with verbs. You can choose a verb which is in its nature more descriptive, it's more precise than adding an for example, the word walk. That can mean somebody walks. You can have a whole lot of word ways of walking. You can modify that with lots of different adverbs, or you could choose a specific verb which is a synonym to walk that specifies more how they're walking. So you're able to use specific words to enhance your writing. We talk about tone. How do you tone? So how do you write something that is the appropriate tone for the purpose of which you're writing that in? And we also talk about spelling, punctuation, and grammar. We weave all that throughout the 2 years. I've also mentioned that but throughout this, we're always coming back to our biblical worldview, talking about these big ideas that have implications. We're able to look at by using imaginative story. We're able to explore lots of really important moral ideas that affect us all. Even though these are old books, the idea back to Great Expectations, exploring the ideas of anti-Semitism, that is as pertinent today as it was back in Shakespeare's time. And we can see that with the news that we have happening all around the world, that this is a big topic that is important for to be discussed, because anti-Semitism has been around for millennium. So we're able to use, by using these great works that are timeless, that the ideas in them, the themes of them, the morality of them is as important today as when they were written. We're able to use and explore the craft of writing, the craft of English, to prepare students really well to think big ideas, to think complex ideas that can create tension, that when we're looking at works, we've got characters who are good, but they're flawed characters. Like, we are all flawed. We're trying to live lives that are pleasing to Christ and grow in Christ likeness, but at the same time we have a body of flesh, and it wars against our best intentions, as Paul talks about. And we're able to, by looking at these imaginative characters and these imaginative worlds of Pride and Prejudice, or Great Expectations, or Tudor or Tudor Venice, we're able to explore that idea that is within all humans, of the tension that exists between nobody's all really bad and nobody's really good. We're a mixture of both, and it's there's lots of ideas that for teens, which can be sometimes quite black and white in their thinking, it allows us that space to have these big ideas. And we try to have lots of discussion about what's happening, not just kind of looking at the nuts and bolts of the way the books are written, but looking at the ideas and discuss them out, and talk about what we think is happening. In particular, when we come to Lewis, the works of C.S. Lewis, that give us lots of good opportunities to have really rich discussions. So I hope that all makes sense. And even if you're not looking to sign your child up for our British literature class, I would encourage you in your home to for whatever age of child you're at, finding those great texts that are age appropriate to look at these big ideas. And that through great works of literature, our children are exposed to good quality writing, a rich vocabulary, which will build a foundation for them to communicate well and to understand the written word really well.